The FBI in Peace and War. Another great story based on Frederick L. Collins' copyrighted book, The FBI in Peace and War. Drama, thrills, action. Tonight's story, Strictly Corn.
Charlie,
Yeah, Doc?
it's a beautiful morning, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Do you admire these fields of waving grass, these tall stalks of Iowa corn?
Yeah, I admire him.
Do you feel friendly and well-disposed toward the good people in the simple white houses which dot the countryside?
Yeah, I feel well disposed. What kind of racket you thinking of, Doc?
Did you see that sign back there about a half mile? Greene County Fairgrounds, 2 miles?
Yeah, I saw it, but I thought we were going to the coast.
Well, we could always use a little extra dough, Charlie, and I got a brand new gimmick.
Oh?
You got that press pass that Shorty Smith made for us?
Yeah, sure, I got it. What for?
Well, you certainly don't think I'm going to pay good money to get into the Iowa State Fair.
Sorry I asked. So after we get in there, what?
We don't get in, Charlie. I go in alone.
Oh? Okay, what do you do when you get in?
Well, I go to the home economics section and start tasting pickles, mayonnaise, salad dressing, stuff like that.
Why? You hungry?
Not exactly.
So what's the angle?
The angle is very simple, Charlie. All we need is the right kind of sucker.
Victor Frisbee, alias the Doc, alias the Major, alias General Frisbee, and 30 other titles, and his partner Charlie Sims, also with aliases, were two of the most active swindlers in the business. Their schemes were always well planned and skillfully carried out, but it was admitted by law enforcement agencies all over the country that when Doc Frisbee made a pitch, he very seldom missed.
Oh, Mrs. Parsons.
Yes?
Good morning, ma'am. I'm Victor Frisbee, the Frisbee Products Corporation. I introduced myself last week at the fairgrounds.
Oh, Mr. Frisbee, of course. Come in, please.
Well, thank you, ma'am.
We weren't expecting company. My sister and I are putting up some preserves. Daisy.
What?
There's a gentleman here, that Mr. Frisbee from the fairgrounds.
Well, you tell him whatever it is, we've got one.
She thinks everyone that comes here is a salesman after my money. Sit down, Mr. Frisbee.
Oh, thank you.
Are you coming, Daisy?
I can't leave these plums, Ella.
Well, that's all right. It's you I want to talk to, Mrs. Parsons, about that blue ribbon you won for the corn relish.
On the corn relish? Oh, wasn't that exciting? I'm going to have my picture in the paper. It's the first blue ribbon I ever won.
You should be very proud.
Oh, I am. But I don't dare let Daisy hear me. She says that pride goeth before a fall, if you know what I mean.
I believe I do. Mrs. Parsons, have you ever thought of putting that relish out on the market?
What market?
Oh, New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Dallas, Fort Worth, a countrywide distribution.
Distribution of what?
Of your corn relish. We might label it Mrs. Parsons' Pride,
You mean sell it to people?
Well, I don't imagine it would be suitable for feeding the livestock, do you?
You mean sell it in grocery stores and supermarkets. Oh, my goodness, you're not talking about my corn relish.
I most certainly am. When I tasted that relish yesterday, I said to myself, Frisbee, you're biting into a gold mine if you can get this product for distribution.
Oh, my. Daisy had better hear this. Daisy!
What?
Can't you please come in, dear?
Oh, all right. Just a minute till I wash my hands.
Oh, she'll be right in. She's washing her hands.
Oh, Mrs. or is it Miss Parsons?
Mrs. My husband passed on 5 years ago. That's why I make relish and things like that. It kind of keeps me busy.
I see. Mrs. Parsons, the relish is your recipe, isn't it?
Oh, yes.
Then you'd be free to give my company exclusive rights for the packaging and distribution.
Well, I suppose so. Oh, well, here's Daisy. Daisy, you remember Mr. Frisbee at the fair yesterday?
Yes, of course. Ella, what in the world do you want with me in the middle of the plums?
Daisy, Mr. Frisbee says that my relish tastes like biting a gold mine, and he wants to distribute it. Isn't that exciting? Sit down, dear, and listen to Mr. Frisbee.
Charlie, my boy, about time you got back. What'd you find out?
Gotta hand it to you, Doc. You sure got a knack for picking suckers. Why, this Parsons dame has got 8 G's tucked away in the savings bank, and she owns that farm, 300 acres, free and clear.
Well, good.
Yeah, but how did you know, Doc, with all the people at that fair?
Charlie, how does a homing pigeon know when he's home? Don't ask me how I know.
It's a genuine talent, I guess, like being lucky with loaded dice.
Yeah, something like that.
Well, how about a drink? I'm tired with all that running around.
Okay, you can have a quick one before you go.
Good, I could use... A go? Where?
Des Moines.
I'm going to Des Moines? Why?
Because tomorrow I'm driving Mrs. Parsons to Des Moines to meet Mr. Charles Sims, president of the wholesale grocery house of Sims and Company.
Oh, I'm a wholesale grocer.
Mm-hmm. And you're going to take 1 teaspoonful of Mrs. Parsons' corn relish, fall on your face with joy, and ask me when we can deliver a trial order of 1,000 cases.
I suppose I don't like this relish.
Well, you better if you want your cut of $8,000.
8, huh? We're going for the works?
Uh-huh.
Well, okay. Here's to it, Doc.
Here's to it. And when I see you tomorrow with Mrs. Parsons, you better know your groceries.
Our first substantial lead on Victor Frisbee came from the publicity director of the Greene County Fair in Iowa. This gentleman, a Mr. Walter Clifford, was very much put out by the Frisbee tactics.
So he came into my office at the fair, flashed this press pass, and said he was going to write an article for his paper about our home economics section.
Did he tell you the name of his paper?
He did. The New York Times.
Were you properly impressed?
Well, frankly, son, I was.
Didn't it occur to you that a New York Times correspondent was somewhat off his beat at the Greene County Fair?
Young man, it did occur to me, and I asked him the same. He said, of course, it was off his beat, but he was on his vacation. When he saw a good, colorful story, well, I guess you know the kind of spiel.
Now about this check he gave you.
Well, after he looked over the fair, he came back up here to the office, and I gave him a lot of information on the prize winners, and he thanked me and started to go. Then he kind of snapped his fingers like he forgot something, took out his wallet, and said, by the way, would it be possible for you to cash a small personal check? It was. I did. It bounced.
Mr. Clifford, did Frisbee give you any hint as to where he was going?
No, sir, he did not. The only thing he wanted to know was a good hotel near Bridgewater.
Mr. Clifford, you said Frisbee wanted information on the prize winners. What prize winners?
The names of the ladies who baked the best cake, made the best salad dressings, things like that, so as he could write his article.
I see.
Well, frankly, son, I don't think you're going to catch up with this Frisbee.
We admit he gets around a bit, but we're not discouraged.
And I would be if I were you. Anybody can get into the fair for nothing. Make out he's a correspondent for the New York Times. Give me a bum check for $50. It's going to be a mighty hard man to catch, believe me.
After we left Mr. Clifford's office, we went to a motel in Bridgewater, where we found that Frisbee had stayed several days with a man who fitted the description of his partner, Charlie Sims. At this precise time, Frisbee and Sims were only 85 miles away at a hotel in Des Moines, where Sims was playing out his role in the swindle.
Mrs. Parsons?
Yes, Mr. Sims?
Mrs. Parsons, in my 30 years in the wholesale grocery business, I have tasted many, many samples of relish. And may I say without fear of contradiction that this is the finest corn relish I have ever tasted. And I would like Mr. Frisbee to place an initial order of 1,000 cases to be delivered immediately.
1,000 cases?
Yes, as an initial order. If this item moves the way I think it will, there's no telling what my reorder situation might be. Mrs. Parsons, it's been a pleasure meeting you, ma'am. And Mr. Frisbee, I congratulate you, sir. It looks as if Frisbee products scooped the market again.
Well, thank you, Mr. Sims. Will you have your office confirm that order by mail?
Oh, yes, we will, sir. Goodbye, Mrs. Parsons.
Goodbye, Mr. Sims.
And, may I say, ma'am, that you're very lucky to have Frisbee products behind you.
I think so.
Yes. Goodbye, Mr. Frisbee. I'll be in touch with you.
Goodbye, Mr. Sims.
1,000 cases. Isn't that wonderful, Miss Frisbee?
Yes, indeed. It's quite an order, Mrs. Parsons, and I'm afraid that's the trouble.
Trouble?
Yes, Sims is not the kind of man to take one jar less than he ordered, and if I have to deliver 1,000 cases, I'll I'll need extra help at the plant, and you know what that means.
Well, I'm not quite sure I do, Mr. Frisbee.
You don't?
Not quite.
Well, it's not your worry anyway. It's mine. If I can't raise the extra money, I can't, that's all. Oh, elevator service is terribly slow here, isn't it?
What do you mean, raise the money, Mr. Frisbee?
Oh, now, don't you worry your pretty head about it, Mrs. Parsons. I'll manage somehow.
Do you mean you'd need money to meet the payroll and buy ingredients?
Mrs. Parsons, I'm sorry I ever mentioned it. Your job is to make the most delicious corn relish in the world, and the financial end is my concern. Going down? Down, boy.
Why, I never heard of any such thing. If he hasn't got enough money to make a few jars of corn relish...
Daisy, it isn't just a few jars. It's 50,000 jars, and he has got the money.
Well, if he has got it, why do you have to lend it to him? I just can't see it, Ella.
Oh, Daisy, sometimes you treat me just like Edgar used to treat me, as if I were a child.
And why do you have to go to Chicago?
Because he wants me to see the factory. After all, I'm not a complete idiot. I told him I'd like to see what I was investing in.
You know hotel food always makes you sick.
I'll take some bicarbonate.
And the way those taxis drive, you'll just get killed.
Oh, Daisy, stop it.
And what would Cousin Oliver have said with your picture on a jar of corn relish?
I don't care what Cousin Oliver would have said, or Edgar, or anybody. This is my chance to do something on my own for once. To be somebody. And I'm not going to let you stop me.
The trail of Victor Frisbee stopped temporarily at the motel in Bridgewater. So Agent Reynolds and I began to explore another angle which had interested us soon after leaving Mr. Clifford's office. Why had Frisbee asked for a list of prize winners? We decided to examine that list. And on the fifth try at the home of Mrs. Ella Parsons, we had the answer.
I thought there was something peculiar about that man. Wait till Ella hears this.
Do you expect your sister back shortly?
I don't know when exactly. She drove into town to go to the bank and do a few errands.
Do you know where she was to meet Frisbee in Chicago?
Well, no, I don't. She'll tell you when she gets here.
Does she have an address book or anything like that, Miss Tucker? It's awfully important that we work fast on this.
Well, I'll look on the desk in her room. She never keeps anything where you can find it, but I'll look.
How fast do you think we can get out of here, Dave?
The plane from Des Moines takes a little bit over an hour.
She's gone. She took the suitcase and her best dress and her coat with the rabbit fur collar and everything. She's gone.
She didn't tell you
Of course not. That's why she waited till I went out in the garden so she could sneak her suitcase into the car. Oh, what a terrible thing to do.
You think she's gone to Chicago, Miss Tucker?
Well, of course she has. She just didn't want to have another fuss with me about money, so she just... Oh, my. Oh, dear me, she couldn't have...
What, Miss Tucker?
She couldn't have taken the money, but I'll bet that's just what she did. Hello, National Bank. Oh, hello, Everett. Did my sister... Oh, she did. Oh, she did. I see. Thank you, Everett. She did. She withdrew $8,000, and she's on her way to Chicago. What do we do now, Mr. Stevens?
As soon as we found that Ella Parsons had gone to Chicago, we took the next plane from Des Moines. Daisy Tucker, Mrs. Parsons' sister, had given us the name of a hotel that had always been used by the men of her family on business trips, feeling sure that her sister would stop there. We moved as fast as we could, hoping to get to Mrs. Parsons before the elusive Mr. Frisbee did.
Yeah, who is it?
Mr. Victor Frisbee calling.
Well, hello, Doc. Come on in. I was just going to shave. So, how'd you make out?
Oh, perfect, Charlie. Everything's arranged for 7:30 this evening. I gave the night watchman a generous fee.
Yeah, okay. What'd you tell him?
Well, I laid it right on the line. I said, look, I want to take a tour through this factory tonight with the lady who's supposed to think that I own the place. What do you say? He said $50, so I gave it to him. Hey, look at the time. I got to get dressed.
Yeah, you taking her to dinner?
Uh-huh.
And, when do we get the dough?
Unless I'm slipping, Charlie, right after she gets a look at the factory. Oh, did they press those suits?
Yeah.
You get dressed, too, Charlie.
Where am I going?
Out to dinner. We're going to bump into you at the Victorian room in the old Lake West Hotel.
What?
Oh, I think it'll be a nice touch. Mr. Sims just happens to be in Chicago on business. You come over to our table, give us a little spiel about corn relish, and go. Adds a bit of class to the act. Don't you think so?
Miss Tucker's guess had been correct. Ella Parsons was registered at a quiet family hotel on the lakefront. We arrived at the hotel just before dinner. Agent Reynolds went up to talk to Mrs. Parsons in her room.
Good evening, Captain. You have a reservation for Victor Frisbee?
Mr. Frisbee?
Yes, I'm having dinner with Mrs. Parsons. She's a guest of the hotel.
Oh, yes, sir. The lady and gentleman have already arrived. This way, please.
There's a gentleman with her?
Yes, sir.
Well, good.
Here we are, sir.
Oh, good evening, Mr. Frisbee.
Good evening, Mrs. Parsons. Thank you, Captain.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Frisbee, this is Mr. Reynolds.
How do you do, Mr. Frisbee?
Very well, thank you, sir.
Won't you sit down, Mr. Frisbee?
Oh, yes, of course.
You're surprised that I know anyone in Chicago.
Oh, no, not at all. I'm quite sure that you have friends and admirers everywhere.
I'm afraid this is my fault, Mr. Frisbee. I dropped in on Mrs. Parsons unexpectedly.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you, sir. Any friend of Mrs. Parsons is a friend of mine. Reynolds, don't I know that name from somewhere?
Mr. Reynolds.
I'm with the government.
Washington, of course. That's where it might have been. I used to go down there quite often to negotiate contracts.
So Mrs. Parsons was telling me. Grocery supplies, isn't it?
Everything for the table, sir. Frisbee Products Corporation.
I've also been telling Mr. Reynolds that we're going to your factory tonight.
Yes, that sounds fascinating. I'd like to go along on that trip.
We'd love to have you, sir. Come along by all means.
Mr. Reynolds wanted to know where the factory was. I couldn't quite tell him, Mr. Frisbee.
Well, it's over on the south side.
It wouldn't upset your plans if I came along?
Oh, no, not at all. As a matter of fact, I'll go call the night watchman and make arrangements.
Sit down, Mr. Frisbee. I just wanted to see how far you'd carry the act. Sit down, please.
But if I don't make arrangements,
I've made all the arrangements, Mr. Frisbee. Here are my credentials, FBI.
FBI.
Mr. Frisbee, how could you do a thing like this to me?
Mrs. Parsons.
Pretending you were going to put up my relish. And all the time you just wanted my money.
Mrs. Parsons,
Saying you were going to put my picture on the jars. How could you?
Mrs. Parsons, I can only say to you what I have said to other investors. If it seems that I...
Yes, Mr. Frisbee?
It's Mr. Sims.
Well. Hello, Mrs. Parsons. Imagine bumping into you in Chicago, of all places, and Mr. Frisbee. Well, this is a surprise.
You're not kidding, Mr. Sims.
Now, what are you two doing here in the big windy city?
Mr.
How about
Sims-
coming over to my table for a drink? I'd like to talk a little business.
Mr. Sims, before you talk any business, I think you'd better meet Mr. Reynolds of the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Hello, Charlie. Glad you dropped in.
FBI? What is this, a pinch?
Uh-huh.
Mr. Frisbee.
I'm sorry, Mr. Sims. He was here when I arrived. Mrs. Parsons allowed me to put my foot in right up to my face.
Mr. Reynolds, do you mind? Could I go to my room now?
Of course. I'll talk to you later. After Agent Stevens takes these men downtown.
Thank you. Goodbye, Mr. Frisbee. I feel very, very sorry for you.
She feels sorry for me.
Mr. Frisbee.
Mr. Sims, it's unfortunate that you came in on this sordid situation. Perhaps with Mr. Reynolds' permission...
Sorry, Doc. I'm taking both of you in. Shall we go along?
What about dinner? I haven't eaten yet.
We'll feed you downtown. For free. On the government.
Okay.
Mr. Frisbee.
Come along, Mr. Sims. You're going to sample that delicious government menu.
I am?
Yes, and if I remember that government menu, you'll wish you had a jar of Mrs. Parsons' corn relish. Believe me.
On advice of counsel, Victor Frisbee and Charlie Sims pleaded guilty to the charges against them and were sentenced to 3 years in prison. During his term, Frisbee wrote letters to Ella Parsons suggesting an honest business partnership when he got out. But Mrs. Parsons' sister succeeded in discouraging this venture by naming it for what it was, strictly corn.
We pause now for station identification.